All right. Well, okay. So I'm really glad to do this today. I'd like to apologize for crashing my computer. I made a whole new, never before seen slideshow for you. And it was a history of Ibogaine, and it had all the personalities. It actually had Curtis Wright, that guy that's the villain in the Purdue Pharma story, who was also the case officer for Ibogaine, who said Ibogaine has zero abuse potential, which more that on that more later. But we were in a government program, and we would go down to a working meeting every 4 months or something. We were talking to people, principally Frank Bocci from the National Institute on Drug Abuse Medications Development. And how to put it, the political situation in the country changed basically when the Republicans took power under Newt Gingrich. And the Democrats were looking for all kinds of ways to cut back and become more centrist and reach out to people who are conservatives. The people who were the AIDS activists were kind of new, but some of the AIDS activists were formerly marijuana activists. And marijuana activists had been banned from ever talking to anybody in the bureaucracy under Nancy Reagan. So a group of people called the Parents Groups, Sue Rushi and Partnership for Drug-Free America, persuaded Alan Leshner that the activists should have no representatives at the panel that made the big decision in 1996 to go ahead or abandon Ibogaine. Instead, they put somebody from the industry on the panel who had an obvious conflict of interest, which was the manufacturer of Suboxone, Reckitt Benckiser. And it was no surprise all the NIDA scientists voted to go ahead because this was the most interesting thing they'd ever seen. And all the industry reps voted to get rid of it. And the industry reps just happened to have one more vote than the scientists. And the activists were nowhere at all. But at the proceeding and in the stuff later, we went and talked to Alan Leshner, me and Eric Sawyer from ACT UP. There was the more or less the promise that somehow they would come up with something non-psychoactive that would do the same thing as Ibogaine. Because it was never said, but they kind of had a position they weren't going to use a hallucinogen, quote unquote, to treat drug dependency. And, there's no actual reason for that, except, they wanted to have something that worked like a cocaine vaccine or the other stuff that Frank Bocci spent his career working on, all of which did not work. But my first slide here is a slide on naltrexone and bupropion, which when we did our little ACT UP thing on meth uptown in Harlem, somebody came that Marcelo, well, let's see what they say they're developing, right? And sure enough, it was this. It was a mixture of naltrexone and bupropion, which is Wellbutrin. And there's a lot of people flogging Wellbutrin today. There's a guy named Shoptaw from LA, but Ken Alper says they've done the same experiment for 30 years and it's never worked. Why are they doing it again? Well, they're doing it because they have to fill up space because they don't want to study Ibogaine. And what you have is two drugs. One is a smoking cessation drug, and the other is a paramorphine drug. And all these drugs, like Vivitrol, buprenorphine, naltrexone, they're all from the other alkaloid in the opium poppy called paramorphine or Ibogaine. and it is 200 times the affinity for the receptor as morphine, and so it forces morphine off the receptor.
Somebody, please mute yourself. Thank you.
Somebody is dying, and you give them a shot of a paramorphine, and they're suddenly not dying. Okay, so actually, I believe this experiment was they were using Wellbutrin, but you can basically they discovered that they didn't expect this. Naloxone has an effect on alcohol. So figuring that all addiction is the same, they said it ought to work for augmenting Wellbutrin. And it increased the efficacy about 2.5%. In fact, hardly at all, because it just doesn't do anything for crystal meth. Okay, everybody knows this. Yeah, I'm going to have to use the cursor. Can you guys see the cursor? This is the Ibogaine molecule. And what I always say is this part here represents, actually resembles serotonin. It also resembles harmaline, except harmaline would have a 6-sided ring here. Harmaline is the stuff in ayahuasca. But this is the porch, which is the other part that actually makes it a stimulant and does not, fit neatly into places where serotonin fits. But if you look at all of these iboga alkaloids here, well, you start out with ibogamine is all hydrogens. Then you have ibogaine. Ibogaine has hydroxyl here. Noribogaine, you get rid of like the carbon. And then over here, in the 18-methoxycoronaridine, you have a carboxyl. And what that seems to do is to kind of neuter. This is the same thing Vocangine has. It kind of neuters the molecule so it doesn't do all kinds of neat things. But the important thing with ibogaine is much easier to go into fat. Noribogaine is not quite as fat soluble. So you have some differences once you get into the brain, full of fat. And here we are, the brain. The important thing is, this is the dopamine system. We're going to talk a lot about the dopamine system in this presentation. But there are 2 nodes, the ventral tegmental axon and the substantia nigra. And the ventral tegmental axon, you think of it as a spark plug, and it goes here through the nucleus accumbens and winds up here in the seat of actual executive decision, the prefrontal cortex. So it can tell the prefrontal cortex, hey, that food, it looks pretty good. This is more like a tracking device, and it goes into the visual circuits because you have to see what you're doing. Now, back in the early 80s, under Nancy Reagan, they said that dopamine is the pleasure switch. But then they did an experiment which proved that that wasn't really the case, because what they did, first they gave a surprise reward to a rat. And sure enough, the rat acquired this extremely salient experience as something it wanted more of because it was a squirt of juice in its tongue. And a rat kind of reacts to that like a hit of crack. But then they paired that with a surprise bell or whistle or light till it was no longer a surprise, and the animal expected it to come a few seconds before the squirt. And sure enough, the dopamine surge tracked the first stimulus it got, and it got aroused expecting to get a squirt a couple seconds before the squirt. Now, what is this important for is this is like the basis of cues in the brain, okay? It's also the reason we can go through a whole complex day doing a bunch of stuff we don't really want to do that much, so we get to the rewarding stuff at the end of the day. And I'll give you another example of this. You remember the yippies throwing money on the stock exchange? Say you're out in the middle of the street on a windy day, and some $20 bills start blowing by in the wind. I guarantee you will grab the $20 bills. Now think about it. $20 bill, you can't eat it, you can't have sex with it, you can't drink it, but it can buy all those things, plus a nice warm roof over your head. So money and capitalism is based on this simple experiment. Here is the dopamine system, except it's a little bit incomplete. But we were talking about tyrosine. Yep, this is the only way this stuff can get through the blood-brain barrier. You have to eat tyrosine. It turns into L-dopa. L-dopa turns into dopamine. Dopamine turns into norepinephrine. So you have all the nice stuff with dopamine, food, sex, and water, and then you have fight or flight down here with norepinephrine. It's kind of similar chemistry. It's making you jump. And the idea is to alert you. Now I will put in a little editorial here, because I have some friends who are kind of from the psychedelic pop movement, kind of dabbled in QAnon, and they are talking about something called adrenochrome. Adrenochrome comes under the norepinephrine. It's not shown here. The important point is up here on the side somewhere where you can't see it is GDNF, which is a peptide that links to a tyrosine-based receptor called RET, and is somehow related to this cascade. This will confer like extension of life and good benefits for Parkinson's, but they can't get it into the limbic system to treat people. They're looking for all kinds of ways, put it on a virus, inject it. The only way you can really reliably get it, cause something to happen there, is to take a dose of Ibogaine. So if Huma Abedin and Hillary Clinton were drinking blood in a basement, the adrenochrome would not cross the blood-brain barrier. So much for more Trump pseudoscience. And here it is. You see up above, we got the part of the brain we were talking about. We showed the brain before. And here's the kidney. Now, where's the kidney in this position or in this exposition? Kidney has something on it called the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland is where that norepinephrine comes in. Literally, this can jolt the heart so that you have a heart attack. It's actually part of the circulatory system. And, you know, conversely, mice that were born without the GDNF gene didn't develop kidneys. They not only didn't develop adrenal glands, but GDNF is important to complete all the time maintenance of anything dopaminergic, anything involving arousal. Now here is what happens when you put a psychostimulant into the dopamine system. Over here, you got cocaine and Ritalin. Over here, you got amphetamine. This one is a reuptake blocker. It's keeping the stuff in hanging out in the synapse because it's not being sucked back by the terminal cell. Here, with methamphetamine, it's just keeps continuously releasing it, burning the brain out for 12 hours. What happens is when you have a big amount of this in the synapse, it's like a bright light flashing in your eyes. It's roughly equivalent to walking out of a dark room into a sunny day. Your eyes tear up. You can't see at first. Some people have an experience of dopamine and they just can't, only about 3% or something, they can't get over it. And this is a real problem. And it is all, to some extent, happening with all addiction. Okay. So don't walk back into the dark room and trip over the table. Okay, here is actually a picture of some mouse midbrain neurons. And you can see that when you gave methamphetamine, just 100 micromolars or something, it caused a diminution of the number of cell bodies and the tracery of neurons. So this is actually does do what they say it does to you. Here's a picture. Now, at the beginning, in 1993, roughly, or 94, there was this discussion about the visualizations. And there was a group of French guys who said the visualizations, we published their monograph, Gonhofer, Goderell, and Jouvet, that Ibogaine was REM mimetic. Now, we all know how healing REM is, so why would you want to get rid of REM? But there were these people from, the parents groups or NIDA or somewhere who were saying we can't use a hallucinogen. So they wanted to get rid of the visualizations. And I stumbled on this thing by Penrose and Hameroff called Quantum Coherence of Microtubules, which explained that the basis of thought is light, right? That basically you have this tracery of microtubules both within the neurons and the dendrites in between the neurons, and it's pumping very faint laser light. And there's quantum coherence, and that's why you don't have like millions of tiny thoughts, each one for a neuron. You have one thought for the whole brain. And it's, on the basis of stuff that Heisenberg would understand. So we said, we believe light is doing something, or as Plato said, spirit persuades matter. Now, here's how you form long-term memories. And when I actually had a fatal heart attack, I was dead for 3.5 minutes when I was in jail for medical marijuana. I don't remember a thing that happened because long-term memories are embedded in calcium, like Kodak Kodachrome films, except it's using that prismatic effect you get from a big shell. And basically your entire somatic imprint of any particular second, especially like visual stuff, is somewhere stored and distributed randomly in calcium in your brain. And you can't take it with you, but I came back, I was revived, and I found out I couldn't remember what happened the night before the heart attack. I just couldn't remember anything. So I said, well, I guess I still have something I still have to learn about life after death. Anyway, right around the same time, and this I didn't see this till a few years later, unfortunately. There was a woman who published stuff a couple years after Hameroff named Nancy Wolf, and she did a thing on the basis of memory storage in mammals. And what she's talking about here is when you change your mind about something. In other words, say you had a situation where there was a theft that occurred and there was this money missing, and you're suspicious of several people, and you decide that it's spread. But then after a few more things happen, you decide, no, it was Sally, you know. Well, then you go back and you actually revise all your memories. You look at everything and say, I didn't look at that, you know. And the basis of that is that ordinary memory here, second box, the ordinary memory uses neurotropins all the time to change things. So if you want to change your cues, it might be a good idea to be able to draft a few neurotropins to do it. But none of this was actually known in 2000. There was, you know, some stuff in the literature about GDNF and alcohol, and they were looking at GDNF for Parkinson's disease, but nobody had actually studied GDNF. And there was a group in California that it was about this time deciding that they were going to study this. But meanwhile, I went to London, and we knew about a certain number of short-acting receptor effects. Now, the very first one was what's called kappa opioid. And the what kappa opioid does is salvia. Salvia is a potent kappa opioid. Just think salvia, and you'll understand this effect, because you have acute dysphoria, you have protection from mu-opioid central nervous system depression, so that you don't overdose or drop dead from shock if you have a major accident, and you have a lot of opiates, natural opiates in your system. But you also, if you have this from the same automobile accident several days later, now all of a sudden your even your hospital opiates stopped working. Kappa opiate is good for chronic upregulation of mu-opiate receptors and continued sensitivity once the acute effect passes. It also, this is really important, it inhibits CAMP, which in the case of heroin withdrawal is something called adenylyl cyclase. See, this is cyclic AMP. This is adenosine, and then the other one. There are two of them. They're like phosphorus. Anyway, the thing is that you get this adenosine, this adenylate cyclase that gives you all the opiate withdrawal effects that you don't want. So Ibogaine gets rid of that right away. And it also downregulates beta arrestin. And beta arrestin is this thing that makes you develop tolerance to all kinds of things. You have this G-coupled protein or G-coupled receptor design that's used for many, many kinds of receptors. And anything that has that, you can get beta arrestin. And beta arrestin means you don't feel it. And when you get tolerance, well, then you have to up the dose, right? So anything that gets rid of tolerance actually is kind of essential if you're going to cycle back to zero, right? Which is what you're trying to do with Ibogaine. But here's the other one that's pretty, it's in all the literature. This is the basis of 18-MC and Ibogaine. And it is a nicotinic receptor blocker. It's what Wellbutrin does, except Wellbutrin does a different population of nicotinic acetylcholine receptors called alpha-4 beta-2. The good thing about alpha-3 beta-4 is it's actually somewhat located in the limbic system. So that's where you need to actually, treat this. If you're if it doesn't treat the limbic system, you're in trouble. So anyway, this modulates the VTA nucleus accumbens through the parallel habenulo interpeduncular pathway. So that, remember, that's a long ventral tegmental axon is like a couple inches long. It's long, really long for like a nerve cell. Anyway, now, one of the things they were doing was they were trying to prove that like somehow Ibogaine works like LSD or psilocybin or one of those things called a type 2A serotonin receptor. And it's actually has a weak effect of that receptor because it turns out that Ibogaine is instead a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And that's what MASH discovered with noribogaine. Noribogaine, she called it sticky Prozac. We couldn't figure out what that meant at first. But see, this kind of shows what it is. This is the outside. This is the inside, right down here. Inside is towards the person. Outside is away from you, right? Now, if you have a regular SSRI like Prozac or cocaine, it freezes the serotonin transporter so it can't grab a serotonin open, like trying to catch a basketball. Now, Ibogaine somehow freezes it closed so that it's like you caught it and it's become a hamburger and it's in your stomach, you know, and you have your arms are not crossed over your stomach, right? So, but it's not working through any particular serotonin receptor. It's working through all of them. It's raising the serotonin level for all the receptors at the same time. Now, there was a guy who did a hatchet job on Ibogaine named Nestor. And, you know, the whole idea that Ibogaine is extremely dangerous was fed, you know, through a few articles. This was in Scientific American. But in this article, which came out in 2016, I believe, he made no reference or acknowledgement whatsoever of any kind of nerve growth factor effect. Now, you could say if you have something like a cancer chemo, which is in a way what a nerve growth neurotropogen is, reverse chemo, but you're still dealing with stuff that's very fundamental. You might be willing to accept there's a little toxicity to get to that, you know. But no, he tried to add 3 things up to make a long-acting effect, and it doesn't really add up. And let me read now. First, the acetylcholine. It says noribogaine stimulates neurons in the habenula that produce the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. This chemical inhibits dopamine neurons further along the addiction reward circuit. It doesn't explain much. Then there's this dopamine. It says it. There's the part that's important here. Noribogaine inhibits dopamine, right? Like it was a blocker of dopamine, which is not exactly really what's happening. Instead of what's happening is, as I will show you later, acetylcholine is used to like transmit and process data. And when you process data in the right way, you stop provoking dopaminergic responses because you say, hey, there's nothing there, right? So you no longer jump. Anyway, the serotonin stuff here, it is trying to say that noribogaine is serotonergic. I haven't seen the data that supports that. This guy was just, you know, I'm only showing this to show that this is kind of like before they had Newton, they had some crystalline balls that the universe was supposed to rotate on. And that came from Alexandria and the library in Alexandria, and it was all wrong. So this is only important because this is what actually causes a lot of the effects of Ibogaine that we don't like. Like It can interfere with the balance, causing dangerous repetitive vomiting in about 1% of Ibogaine treatments. The fact that it's implicated in tardive dyskinesia, that something that thorazine and haloperidol also have, is not important because you don't take Ibogaine that frequently. And in microdose, it certainly won't have the effect. It blocks NMDA toxicity. But the sigma was something that 18MC supposedly got rid of. So this was a big advance. But then the problem was it also got rid of this one. And this one we kind of like, because this is the one I was talking about before, the coincidence detector. And when I was in London, I said, if regrowth is taking place in an Ibogaine treatment, then you need some way to have controlled flutter here to let some calcium in so that you can build new dendrites and stuff. And we have a problem because there's a guy named Olney who took out a patent for Ibogaine for stroke, but happened to mention Parkinson's. I wish he hadn't done that one. Anyway, the point is, what this does, either through NMDA or through glycine, is it can open up this channel. And it turned out that it was good for both physical withdrawal from opiates, but also something called supersensitization, which is where you can't stop using like Coke, or can't stop doing potato chips even, And binge behavior is something that actually Ibogaine kind of addresses. So, when people, well, would it be good for gambling? You got to give it to the person and see, but it might. But the important thing is that you have a stroke. What happens is these things open up, and then they send out more glutamates, and they open up the one next to them, and pretty soon you lose half the brain. So Ibogaine actually could be used to stop a stroke, just like ketamine can be used to stop a stroke. You don't need the anti-stroke med from the hospital. And let me see here. Here's the kind of stuff I was talking about, rebuilding inside the nucleus. And this is, a representation. But when you treat, you want to be able to rapidly grow a bunch of new cytoskeletal material. In other words, the cytoskeleton are these microtubules, and you want to be able to kind of rewire the brain. It does. And here's how it does it. This is GDNF. These are mouse neurons, and they were neuroblastomas, so they're very vigorous. And you can see here, they're not talking to each other. They gave them a bunch of GDNF, Ibogaine, right? Increased GDNF secretion 12-fold within 6 hours. And look, they're regrowing a tracery of dendrites here to talk to each other. Here's a different graph showing, the effect is quite dramatic. This is immediately in the middle of Ibogaine visualizations. Now, the GDNF is ordinarily, comes along. It's